one last look at these Christian brave hearts, beloved. If you want one brief book that best tells the story of the Scottish Covenanters, Jock Purvis has a great little paperback called Fair Sunshine. It sums it up richly and beautifully. Well, we're at 1670s now, and the final 10 years or so of this fiery furnace when the Scottish faith shone most brightly and so many thousands were martyred and suffered. This preaching at field meetings had become a capital offense, and yet they still preached. They refused to obey man rather than God, and the churches only grew in number. These outdoor meetings were called conventicles, and indeed the blood of the martyrs continued to become the seed of the church. The government stirred up the Highlanders from the north to invade, pillage Covenanters. Officers eventually permitted these Highlanders to shoot on the spot any Covenanter worshippers in violation of the authorities. Says one writer, through unrelenting persecution, these decent congregations were transformed into what their persecutors had at first falsely asserted them to be: battalions of armed men, resolved to defy opposition, prepared to take the field against their aggressors. Now, this is a major area where some might disagree with the Covenanters, though it's always easy to say these things in hindsight when we're there and in their context. But some of the Covenanters did take up arms. They were hunted so mercilessly by the dragoons, these Anglican troops, and they believed that out of self-defense, like Nehemiah, for love of God and country, starting with their protection of their own homes, they had to even march out against the royal armies. There were four major battles the Covenanters won. Drumclog, 1679, was one of them. There were others that they lost. Rowland Green, Bothwell Bridge, Aird's Moss. Were they revolting against God-ordained authorities, or were they resisting foreign oppression and fighting for God and for their nation? It's not an easy question to answer, but no one can fault the courage and valor of these men who believed God required them to rise up, and that religious freedom was worth defending. As Alexander Smelly puts it, they could not understand a piety, a spirituality divorced from patriotism and good citizenship. Now, having said this, there was probably a greater number of Covenanters who did not believe in revolting and were, we are told, willing to persevere patiently, prayerfully until the dawn of better days. Well, by the 1680s, there were only a growing number of executions of the Covenanters, as the historian puts it, differing only in their degrees of horror and atrocity. 1684-85, known as the Killing Times, most ruthless period of persecution. During this entire 28-year fiery furnace, so many heroic Christians arose that it's hard to know where to start. That book, Fair Sunshine, is a great summary, but there's just an abundance of Christian courage and bravery on so many fronts that the whole Christian world owes a legacy to these Covenanters. And so much of the modern Christianity we have today around the world and the fruit in gospel missions was because of these Scottish Covenanters. It's like the writer of Hebrews 11 says, speaking of the great hall of suffering and faith, these were men of whom the world was not worthy. And at one point, in a kind of holy frustration, in Hebrews 11, he says, and what more shall I say? I don't have time to tell of Gideon and Barak and so forth. I feel that way as well with this tremendous story. But just a few closing examples of Christian brave hearts. John Brown was a peasant farmer. He's accused of hosting the great preacher Alexander Payden. And so right in front of his cottage, with his wife next to him, holding their new baby in her arms and the 2-year-old child standing next to him as well, they said, "Do you recant?" He said, "I cannot." And they shot him in cold blood. Then they looked at his wife and said, "What do you think of your husband now?" To which she said, "I thought much, and even more now." "Muckle me now," she said. Donald Cargill, as he mounted the scaffold, said these words that became famous, rallying cry among the Scottish saints. He says, "I mount this ladder with less fear and less perturbation less trepidation than I ever mounted the pulpit. There was a 16-year-old boy. We don't even know his name, but they were about to hang him, and they said, what if we drop you down? And looking at this canyon, and he says, you drop me down if you will. It's not so deep as hell. And they dropped him with the final warning on his lips to his enemies, God's enemies. Margaret Wilson, 18 years old, drowned in the Solway Firth with her 3 younger sisters watching on. She was sentenced to die, given the chance to recant. All she had to say was, God save the king. That's it. But she knew that meant replacing Christ's lordship with an earthly king, and she refused. She said never. She went down quoting the words of Psalm 25, tied to a stake, waiting for the tide to drown her. And she cried out in the language of that 25th Psalm, remember not the sins of my youth, O Lord, and my rebellious ways. According to your love, remember me. For you are good, O Lord. And that's what it was with basically every Covenanter martyr. They died praying. They died with the Psalms on their lips. They had been raised singing the Psalms, and they died praising their Lord. The last Covenanter martyr on record is James Renwick. His persecutors saw his steadfastness for God's truth, refusing to compromise and defile his conscience. And so they said, this man must be of old John Knox's principles. And some of Renwick's last words on the scaffold to his followers were these: keep your ground, and the day will come when the Lord will send you teachers and ministers, and when these despised truths shall become glorious in the land again. And they did. Charles II died, 1689, the glorious revolution. William and Mary were enthroned, bringing freedom of religion, at last, what they had prayed for so long. A couple closing slides to sum up what we've seen and learned. The 1670s, meeting out in these conventicles, refusing to bow. Then John Brown and the others we've mentioned, all because of Christ's crown and his covenant. Then these words that sum up well their legacy. And by the way, before I read this hymn about the Covenanters, remember how Revelation chapter 12 puts it so well. The martyrs who are right now around the throne of God, says they overcame Satan by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. Rather, these are tribulation martyrs. Why? Why did they conquer Satan? Because of the blood of the Lamb, because of Christ and his cross. Second, because of the word of their testimony. They were unashamed of the Lord, so he was unashamed of them, and they stood by their confession. And third, they didn't love their lives so much as to shrink from death. May the Lord give us grace to follow in their train. And shall we let the memory of those days be lost, of those who cherished truth and counted not the cost, and rather than betray the truth they loved, stained heather bells and moorland with their blood? Nay, let us guard their memory and retell the valor of their deeds and how they fell before the cruel scythe of harsh dragoon and entered rest to wear a martyr's crown.